Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Quick Dvar Torah, word from the weekly Torah portion. This week, of course, is Tisa. Has many elements to the story, but one I think of the most compelling is the story of Moshe being on Mount Sinai, receiving the Ten Commandments from God, and being informed that while he's up on Mount Sinai, the Jewish people down below have created a golden calf and are worshiping it. God tells him, informs him of what has taken place, and Moshe rushes down to see what's happening. And the verse says that when he gets down there, when he approaches and gets close to the camp, he sees the calf, he sees what they're doing, machalot, and the dancing and the rejoicing that they're engaged in, and he becomes angry. Moshe becomes angry, and he tosses the Ten Commandments, he tosses the tablets and smashes them. And one of the questions that a number of people ask is that he already knew that the Jewish people were sinning with the golden calf. God told him when he was at the top of the mountain, and God's a pretty good witness. If God already told them that they were sinning, why doesn't he get angry then? Why doesn't he get furious then? Why is it only when he gets down to the bottom of the hill, Vayar, and he sees what's taking place, that he then all of a sudden really gets angry and he smashes the tablets at that point in time? And so one thing you might be able to say is that this is when he first sees what's taking place. The verse actually says, Vayar, he sees that they are sinning. And we believe that there's nothing really like seeing something. In fact, we learned this from God much earlier in the Torah. When God is going to punish the people of Sodom and Gomorrah for sinning, it first says that he sees what's taking place. He hears the crying of those who are suffering as a result of their behavior. And I think God, of course, doesn't need to see, doesn't need to hear, doesn't need to be anthropomorphized. God knows always what's taking place. But the Torah uses the language of human sight and human hearing to teach us a lesson. And the lesson is, just as God is going to check everything out, and God doesn't even need to do that before making a judgment, so obviously we should too as well. We should be very careful about judging anyone. We should make sure that we see the situation with our own eyes and really understand the situation well before jumping to any type of conclusions. There's a small little book called the Main and Shel Torah that offers another answer to this question of why Moshe only gets angry and throws the tablets down when he gets closer to the camp. And what this Torah says is that there is one word that is missing in God's description of the sin that appears the second time when the Torah tells us Moshe sees the sin. And that one word is mecholot. That when Moshe came down, he sees them dancing and rejoicing and singing with their sin of the golden calf. When God explains it, just says that they're sinning. They built this golden calf. And according to some, what was taking place in Moshe's mind was as follows. When God tells him that they're sinning, he says, okay, people sin all the time. People sin out of temptation, out of fear. They just can't control themselves, whatever the case may be. People sin for a lot of different reasons. When I get down there, I'll show them the error that they've made. They'll realize they made a mistake, and then eventually they'll do tshuva, they'll repent, and they'll fix the situation. So I'm not worried. But when he gets down there and he sees them singing and dancing and rejoicing in their sin, he says, oh, that's a totally different story. You can't correct a sin if you're rejoicing in your sin, if you love it, if you're so filled with joy and happiness at that moment. At that point in time, Moshe becomes depressed and despondent and despairs that they'll be able to actually repair themselves and correct the situation. And therefore, that's why he then loses it, gets angry, and smashes the tablets, because he doesn't see a way out at that point in time. Now, on one hand, this is perhaps a little bit of a depressing idea to talk about, that the Jewish people were rejoicing in this absolutely terrible sin. But I think embedded within the story is an incredibly important lesson, and that is the lesson of what joy does for us. Moshe sees people sinning with joy. He says, it can't be fixed. What about if we sort of put the shoe on the other foot? What about things like doing mitzvahs, doing positive things? Very often we're given the choice of doing it with joy or just doing it, rote, or just doing it because it's an obligation that we have to do it. So here I think we can learn something very important, that if you come across something that's difficult and challenging, well, you may be pushed away from doing that for a whole series of different reasons. being tempted to go somewhere else, or that it's too difficult. You don't want to put in the effort. But if you can somehow infuse that activity with joy, that's a buffet. That will protect you to make sure that you can keep doing it. You'll have the encouragement to stick with it even when things begin to get tough. Joy has that ability. Think about if you learn how to pray with joy, or learn Torah with joy, or give tzedakah, charity with joy, or visit the sick with joy. Right? If you can add joy to all those activities, when the moment comes, and the moment's for sure going to come when you don't want to do it, or you can't do it, or it's struggling to do it, it's getting hard. If you've infused those activities with joy, that will help you to go fulfill that mission nevertheless. Joy is a buffet of so many different things. It helps us spiritually. It helps us physically as well. I came across an interesting study once about a group of nuns. It was a longitudinal study of several decades. And the design was brilliant because it looked at a group of nuns that lived together in a monastery for decades. And what was interesting is you're able to control for a lot of variables, right? They ate the same food. They had the same activities. They had the same access to medical care. Really, they had everything was the exact same. Just what you couldn't control necessarily, what was going inside their minds, what was happening inside their heads. And so when the nuns were young, the researchers asked them to describe their personalities and their outlook on life and things along those lines. And then they waited, and we had another set of researchers pick this up decades later, and they noticed when the nuns who had described themselves early in their lives as happy, filled with joy, seizing life with simcha, with happiness and joy, so some full 90% of them were still alive at age 84, where the number of those who had described themselves as not overly happy, they felt the obligation of being in the monastery, but they weren't happy. They didn't find joy in everyday living necessarily. Only 34% of them were still alive at age 84. And at age 94, 54% of those nuns who described them as filled with joy were still alive, while only 11% of those who had not. That joy really could be a protection for us physically and spiritually. And because of that, and it's so important aspect of our lives, it's not something that you can wait for. It's too valuable to leave up for coincidence, right? Very often people think joy is going to come about because there's an event that I'm experiencing that will cause the joy. But I think what we learned from this week, and I would say that we learned from the whole concept of Adar, the month that we're now celebrating, where the rabbis teach us Misha Nichnas Adar, when the month of Adar comes in, we're marbit b'simcha. We're supposed to add to our joy. It's a very odd statement to make. I mean, joy seems to be a feeling, an emotion. How can you create that emotion? It depends on what's going on in my life, no? And the rabbis are saying, yeah, no, that's not the case. It's something that you can control, that you can infuse it. You don't wait for it to happen, but rather you infuse it into aspects of your life. And it will make those things more successful in fulfilling what you want to accomplish. So I spoke earlier about religious things such as visiting the sick or davening, praying with greater joy. But you can add this to all aspects of your life, right? If you spend time with your kids, make sure that you add something joyous in that experience, because it's important that you spend time with your kids, and the more joyous the experience is, the more you'll want to do it. Or with elderly parents, or in whole aspects, whole many different aspects of our lives. We have to add right away, can't leave it up to chance, add right away joy to that activity in our lives, and we'll make sure that we'll continue to do it even when times get tough. Shabbat Shalom.